Today we'll be discussing about the INI CET November 2021 ophthalmology recall questions. Okay, so totally about 9 questions were asked in ophthalmology. Most of the questions were direct, straightforward. Okay, and some confusing questions also were there. So we'll go through all the questions in detail today. Okay, the first question they asked is, where is the most likely lesion in the visual defect? So they had given a picture like this. Okay. What defect is this? The patient is not having visual field on the temporal side of both the eyes. So this is a bitemporal hemianopia. This is a bitemporal hemianopia. So we discussed in case of the optic chiasma lesions, we have a bitemporal hemianopia. Okay. So this typically is in the lesion of a optic chiasma. This is the lesion of an optic chiasma. So we'll quickly go through the various visual field defects and the visual pathway, right, starting right from the optic nerve until the occipital cortex. Firstly, if it is a unilateral optic nerve involvement, the patient will have an ipsilateral monoocular visual field loss. So all these slides have been taken from the PowerPoint presentation which we have discussed in the class. Okay, so all these slides have already been discussed in detail. In the this was discussed in the neuro-ophthalmology discussion. Okay, so here we have a unilateral optic nerve lesion. We have a monoocular vision loss. Next, what happens in the optic chiasma? So in the optic chiasma, the nasal fibers, the 53% of the nasal fibers cross over to the opposite side, while the temporal fibers of the retina continue on the same side. So each optic tract will have the temporal retinal fibers on the same side and the opposite side nasal fibers. So because of the crossing over, what happens? Any optic chiasmal lesion will result in the damage to the nasal fibers. We know the nasal fibers are responsible for the temporal field of vision. Since the nasal fibers are responsible for the temporal field of vision, an optic chiasmal lesion will result in a bitemporal hemianopia. Okay, the reason we have a bitemporal hemianopia is because of the crossing over which happens at the optic chiasma. So this, see from this table, in the last 3 exams, be it your last NEET exam or be it your last 2 INI CET exams, they have asked questions from this. So previously 2 times they asked about the optic tract. So this time they have asked about the optic chiasma. So this is very important. So that's the reason I'm discussing this in detail in the first slide. Okay. So the second, so I told you the nasal fibers cross over at the, and this is a incongruous type of a defect. Okay. Congruous means on the same side of the visual field. So in case of a optic tract lesion, since there is a crossing over of the fibers, there is a contralateral homonymous hemianopia. In the optic tract, there is the involvement of the temporal fibers and there is involvement of the nasal fibers of the opposite side. So the nasal fibers supply the temporal retina, hence the opposite side temporal retina will have a visual field defect and the ipsilateral nasal retina will have a field defect. So always remember, the optic tract lesion will result in a contralateral homonymous hemianopia. What is homonymous? So bitemporal is a type of a heteronymous. Why heteronymous? Because it is opposite sides. So both the side temporal is involved, so it is a heteronymous. Homonymous is on the same side of both the eyes. So remember, any lesion beyond the optic tract will result in a homonymous hemianopia. Homonymous hemianopia. Next, we have the optic radiation fibers arising from the optic tract. So the optic radiation fibers, we can divide them into 2 parts. The fibers which pass through the parietal lobe or the upper optic radiation fibers, the lower optic radiation fibers which pass through the temporal lobe. So the upper optic radiation fibers which pass through the parietal lobe results in a contralateral inferior quadrantanopia. So this is a contralateral inferior quadrantanopia. So this inferior quadrantenopia is also known as pi in the floor. Pi in the floor. And the temporal fibers, I told you the temporal fibers or the lower optic radiation fibers result in a contralateral superior quadrantenopia. This contralateral superior quadrantenopia is also known as pi in the sky. Pi in the sky. One very important point to remember here is the lower optic radiation fibers which pass through the temporal lobe are also known as the Meyer's loop. So they can ask you, what does a lesion in a Meyer's loop result in? So remember, a lesion in the Meyer's loop is nothing but the optic radiation fibers passing through the temporal lobe. So it results in a superior quadrantenopia or pi in the sky. The last one is the lesion of the occipital cortex. So one important thing we have to remember in the occipital cortex is that the occipital cortex receives dual blood supply from the posterior cerebral artery and the middle cerebral artery. Because it receives dual blood supply from the posterior cerebral artery and the middle cerebral artery, the macula is spared. The macula is spared. Macula is spared. So any lesion of the occipital visual cortex results in a contralateral homonymous hemianopia with a macular sparing. Homonymous hemianopia with macular sparing. The reason for the macular sparing is, I told you, the dual blood supply of the middle cerebral and the posterior cerebral artery, which is the watershed area. Hence, the main vision or the 90% of the vision which contributed by the macula is still preserved in a patient with an occipital lobe lesion. Next, we should know the lesions compressing the optic chiasma. So this time they have asked about bitemporal hemianopia. So we should know how does a pituitary tumor compress the optic chiasma and how does a craniopharyngioma compress the optic chiasma. So as you can see in the image, so in case of a pituitary tumor, they spread from below. The pituitary is above the sella turcica, so it spreads from below. So it compresses the inferior fibers first. Okay, so a pituitary tumor, it compresses the inferior fibers first. So as we know, the inferior fibers supply the superior part of the visual field. So this will begin as a descending bitemporal hemianopia. This will begin as a descending bitemporal hemianopia. Okay. Next is a craniopharyngioma. So the craniopharyngioma, it spreads down from above. So a craniopharyngioma, since it spreads down from above, the inferior fibers are the inferior field is first involved. So a craniopharyngioma results in an ascending type of a bitemporal hemianopia. This is a very important question. So this we can expect in the coming exams. So a pituitary adenoma will result in a descending type of a bitemporal hemianopia, while a craniopharyngioma results in an ascending type of a bitemporal hemianopia. The reason being, in the pituitary tumor, the inferior fibers are first compressed, while in a craniopharyngioma, the superior fibers are first compressed. So this is how the image presents. So you can see the pituitary mass and the craniopharyngioma. The pituitary mass results in a descending type of a bitemporal, while a craniopharyngioma results in an ascending type of a bitemporal hemianopia. So next is the junctional scotoma of trachea. What is a junctional scotoma of trachea? So we know that the nasal fibers cross over on the opposite side. The 53% of the nasal fibers cross over on the opposite side. So the junction between the optic nerve and the optic chiasma, if any tumor compresses on the optic nerve at this junction, so what happens? The ipsilateral central visual field is lost and a contralateral temporal field of vision is lost. Okay, so again, depending on the location of the tumor, usually in majority of the cases it is the superior quadrantenopia of the opposite side. Why superior quadrantenopia? So if you take this as the optic chiasma, the crossing over of the optic chiasma, so what happens? In the nasal fibers, usually they form a loop. Okay, the nasal fibers before crossing, they form a loop. This loop is known as the von Willebrand loop. Von Willebrand loop. So this von Willebrand loop, what happens? Any compressive lesion of this von Willebrand loop will result in the temporal field vision of the contralateral side. Okay, so this is the junctional scotoma of trachea. So typically the patient will have a ipsilateral central visual field loss and a contralateral temporal visual field loss. Usually it is the superior quadrant which is affected in a junctional scotoma. This again they can ask you. So you should know about the von Willebrand loop. You should know about the junctional scotoma. You should also know about the crossing over of the fibers. Okay, so the second question they asked is which step of cataract surgery is done here. So we can see that the red glow is clearly seen. This is a capsulorhexis forceps. This is a capsulorhexis forceps, and you can see a flap being raised. Okay, so this procedure is the capsulorhexis procedure, in which we make a 5 millimeter anterior capsular opening before we go and do the hydrodissection procedure and hydrodelineation procedure, and we go ahead with the phacoemulsification. So this is a clinical question. What is happening nowadays in the recent, if you see the trend in the last 2-year question papers, both your NEET and INICET, there is a lot of, they're combining subjects and asking questions. Okay, one thing is you will get a lot of overlap questions from ophthalmology along with medicine, neurology. Okay, so they want to see if you have understood the topic correctly or if you have just memorized it and come for the exam. Okay, so they are going in the pattern of USMLE paper. So the FMCG papers, like how they ask a clinical question, nowadays more of clinical questions are coming up. Okay, so this, if you have attended your ophthalmology OT and you have seen the procedure, only then you will be able to answer. Okay, this is a capsulorhexis. This is the opening in the anterior capsule. Okay, so usually around 5 millimeter we make an opening. We make a circular opening before doing a hydrodissection and a hydrodelineation. Okay, so this is the capsulorhexis. So capsulorhexis we can either do with the forceps known as the Uttarata forceps, or we can do with a needle. Okay, bent needle we can use for making a capsular opening. Okay, so the needle is bent at an angulation of 45 degrees and the tip is bent at 90 degrees. So this is used for making a capsulorhexis opening. So after we do the capsulorhexis opening, the hydro procedure is done, wherein the fluid wave is passed. So usually it is a cortical cleaving type of a hydrodissection, wherein the fluid wave is passed behind the lens capsule, after which the lens will slightly rise. Okay, so this, what you see, the golden ring, is a feature of a hydrodelineation. The golden ring sign is a feature of the hydrodelineation. So what happens in a hydrodelineation? We go inside the substance of the lens nucleus and inject the fluid. There will be a separation of the central nuclear core from the outer cortex. So in a hydrodelineation, we are separating the central nuclear core from the outer cortex. So this is typically done in case of a cataract known as a posterior polar cataract. So in a posterior polar cataract, we know the thinnest part of the capsule is the posterior pole. So what is the hydrodelineation process? In a hydrodelineation, the fluid wave, I told, is injected into the substance of a nucleus, thereby the central nuclear core is separated from the outer cortex. So because of this, we get a golden ring like reflex. This is a characteristic feature of a hydrodelineation. Hydrodelineation is typically done in a cataract known as a posterior polar cataract. So in a posterior polar cataract, we have to do a hydrodelineation. We have to be very gentle. We have to maintain the anterior chamber, because any fluctuation in the anterior chamber can result in a posterior capsular tear, and this can precipitate a posterior capsular rent. Okay, so we have to be very careful, and hydrodelineation is the golden ring. Okay, so this can be a potential question in the forthcoming exams. So again, we got one question from COVID. Okay, so what is the most common ocular manifestation of COVID-19? So in the eye, okay, so we discussed the typical presentation of a patient in the eye is follicular conjunctivitis. So nowadays, what is happening? Initially, the patient presents with follicular conjunctivitis, and later the fever develops. Okay, so any patient with a suspected follicular conjunctivitis with fever and body ache arising 2 to 3 days later, we are subjecting them to a COVID RT-PCR, and about 80 to 90% of them are turning positive. Okay, so remember, the most common presentation is the follicular conjunctivitis. So in the follicular conjunctivitis, we have fever, headache, conjunctivitis, mucosal lesions. We can also have a hemophagocytosis. So these are the various other systemic manifestations which occur with COVID. The neurological manifestations include headache, dizziness, encephalopathy, Guillain-Barré syndrome. So you can take a screenshot of this photo, okay, and you can remember, because you will invariably get 1 or 2 questions in the forthcoming exams also, okay. So in the eye, from the eye point of view, I told follicular conjunctivitis is the most common presentation of COVID, okay. Nowadays, with the third wave, majority of the symptoms are more of a gastrointestinal, okay. There's hepatic and gastrointestinal involvement. Typically, patients presenting with more of diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, anorexia, okay, and elevated liver enzymes, okay. So is there any conjunctivitis between COVID and conjunctivitis? Okay, connection between conjunctivitis and COVID. So this was published by the Oxford Press. So in March 2020 itself, they have said that the conjunctival secretions and tears from a COVID patient contain the virus RNA. So always remember, the secretions in a COVID patient, the conjunctival secretion, the tear secretion, they shed the virus. So any patients with conjunctivitis pose a greater risk than those without ocular symptoms. So these patients are a higher risk of transmitting it to the other people. Conjunctivitis is easier to spread. That's what they intend to say. Okay. So remember, healthcare workers should assume that the ocular fluids from all patients are potentially infected and should wear protective eye protection. Should wear eye protection. Okay. So since last 1 year, the second wave and the third wave, what we see is the common presentation is the patient comes with a follicular conjunctivitis after 3-4 days, fever, body ache, okay, and then when we do the RT-PCR, it turns out positive. So that is the most common presentation. So follicular conjunctivitis. Next question, identify the sign given in the picture. Okay, so this clearly, when we discussed cataracts, I told you about the Washer's ring and I told you about the rosette cataract. So these are all features of blunt trauma. So what is Washer's ring? So this is a ring-like pigmentation on the anterior lens capsule. This ring-like pigmentation on the anterior lens capsule occurs following a trauma, following a blunt trauma. Okay, this is known as the Washer's ring. So we should also know about the other rings. So they've asked, you should know about the Kesha-Fletcher ring, you should know about the Weiss ring, you should also know about the Fleischer's ring. So we'll discuss all of them now. Okay. So KF ring, we already know it is deposition of copper in the Descemet's membrane. The copper deposition in the Descemet's membrane is a feature of Wilson's disease. In addition to that, the patient can have encephalopathy. The patient, there's an increased serum ceruloplasmin level in these patients, and also the cataract. What kind of a cataract we get? We get a sunflower cataract. Okay, and sunflower cataract is a pseudo cataract. What is a pseudo cataract? So pseudo cataract means it does not cause a significant visual disturbance. So remember, the KF ring and the pseudo cataract does not cause any significant visual disturbance in a patient with Wilson's disease. Wilson's disease. Okay, you should remember KF ring, deposition of copper in the Descemet's membrane. One more important thing you have to remember is these patients, you have to subject these patients to a gonio. Okay, so gonioscopy, we can see that the trabecular meshwork also shows, the Schwalbe's line also shows the copper deposition on your gonioscopy. So the Descemet's membrane ends at the Schwalbe's line, which shows the presence of copper in these patients. Next, we should know about the Fleischer's ring. What is Fleischer's ring? Fleischer's ring is a characteristic feature of keratoconus. So epithelial iron deposition. It is nothing but epithelial iron deposition at the base of the cone. Epithelial iron deposition at the base of the cone is your Fleischer's ring. So typically these Fleischer's ring patients, we can visualize it 360 degrees around the cone. So it is nothing but the tear film. Okay, the tear film around the cone stagnates, resulting in the Fleischer's ring. Another important thing in a keratoconus, we should know about the scissoring reflex on retinoscopy. We should also know about the oil drop sign. Okay, on a distant direct ophthalmoscopy, we'll see an oil drop reflex. So remember, oil drop reflex in keratoconus and oil drop cataract. So oil drop cataract is a feature of galactosemia. So you should know oil drop reflex is seen in distant direct ophthalmoscopy. Distant direct ophthalmoscopy, and oil drop cataract is seen in galactosemia. Next is the Ferry's line. So what is Ferry's line? So Ferry's line is nothing but corneal epithelial iron deposition at the edge of the filtering bleb. So at the edge of the filtering bleb, we have iron deposition, which is known as the Ferry's line. Next is the Stocker's line. What is Stocker's line? Stocker's line, in case of pterygium, we see that there is epithelial iron deposition in the patient. So this epithelial iron deposition in a progressive pterygium patient is known as the Stocker's line. Stocker's line. Last is the Hudson-Starley's line. What is Hudson-Starley's line? Epithelial iron deposition in the inferior third of the cornea, typically seen in aging. So if it is due to aging, it is known as Hudson-Starley's line. So this you can get as potential question. So you should know about the Hudson-Starley's line. You should know about the Stocker's line, the Ferry's line, KF ring and the Fleischer's ring. KF ring in case of Wilson's, Fleischer's ring in case of keratoconus. It's very important all. Okay. Next, we'll discuss a few points about the Wies ring. So this time we've asked a Wies ring. So what is Wies ring? So Wies ring is a feature of a posterior vitreous detachment. Posterior vitreous detachment. So what we discussed in retina, the attachment of the vitreous, the various attachments of the vitreous. We discussed that the attachment of the vitreous is strongest at the ora serrata. The strongest point of attachment of the vitreous is at the ora serrata. The next strongest point of attachment of the vitreous is around the optic disc. Okay, and again vitreous can be attached along the retinal blood vessels. So these are the various attachment of the vitreous. So remember the detachment of the vitreous usually typically begins from the posterior pole, hence the name posterior vitreous detachment. Okay, so presence of a posterior vitreous detachment. So here you will see the presence of a ring in front of the disc. Okay, this ring indicates that the vitreous has separated and it has come forward. So this ring is indicating that the attachment of this vitreous around the optic disc has separated and it has come forward. So this Wies ring is a feature of a posterior vitreous detachment. So around the optic disc, if the ring, the vitreous has given way and it comes forward, it is known as the Wies ring. So remember, when we're doing a pars plana vitrectomy, when we're doing any retinal surgery, we have to induce a posterior vitreous detachment before taking in the patient for either a buccal or a endo laser. Okay, so first PVD has to be induced in any pars plana vitrectomy. Okay, if it's a natural PVD, we'll characteristically see the Wies ring. Okay, on indirect ophthalmoscopy. On a indirect, you can see it either on the indirect ophthalmoscopy or also on the slit lamp examination. Okay. What history is important regarding this picture? So previously we saw the presence of a Washer's ring. So I told you blunt trauma to the eye is the most common cause for presence of Washer's ring. So the answer here is history of blunt trauma. Okay, so you should know the various complications of blunt trauma in the eye. Okay, so this slide will summarize the various important complications. So one important thing is the hyphema. Okay, so remember, whenever the hyphema involvement of more than 1/2 of the anterior chamber, when more than 1/2 of the anterior chamber is involved with blood, we have to immediately give an AC wash and clear off the blood, because else there will be a corneal staining of the blood. Okay, and this can result in a glaucoma called as the khaki cell glaucoma. So we have to clear off the hyphema from the anterior chamber. So next, it can present with the sphincter tear. So I told you the attachment of the iris is weakest at the root of the iris. At the root of the iris can detach. There can be a sphincter tear resulting in either a iridodylisis or a sphincter tear. Next important, just now we discussed the presence of a iris pigments on the anterior lens capsule known as the Washer's ring. So these are all straightforward. So if you've just attended the class and listened to what we have discussed, so all these will be easy. You would have got all of them right. Okay. So all the questions which have come are all straightforward questions, barring a couple of them. Okay. So most of them you could have easily answered with just attending the class. Okay, so this is your Washer's ring. Next is the rosette cataract. I told you rosette cataract is a feature of blunt trauma. Also, in case of a very severe impact injury, there can be a anterior subluxation of the lens. Okay, this is common in case of very high impact injuries. Okay, anterior subluxation of the lens. Also, you can see the presence of an angle recession on gonioscopy. So when you're doing a gonioscopy, you can see the presence of an angle recession. Presence of an angle recession is a feature of blunt trauma. The last point is the presence of a rupture of the globe. Okay, so there can be a globe rupture in case of a penetrating and a perforating injury. So we should know what are the impact of a blunt injury, a penetrating injury, and a perforating injury. So quickly we'll go through that. Okay, so a blunt injury in the eye, it can cause, in the lens, it can cause a traumatic rosette cataract. It can cause a vitreous hemorrhage, a commotion presence of retinal holes and retinal detachment can be there. There can also be a choroidal rupture and choroidal prolapse. What is a perforating injury? What is a penetrating injury? So penetrating injury, there's only an entry. If there's an entry and exit, it is a perforating injury. So a through and through injury, which has both the entry and the exit, is a perforating injury. A penetrating injury just has an entry. So penetrating injury can result in a traumatic cataract, can result in lens prolapse, anterior subluxation, I told you, hemorrhage, vitreous prolapse can be there, retinal laceration, retinal detachment, and choroidal prolapse can be there. Last is the perforating injury. So perforating, I told you, full thickness through and through injury. So the presentation is almost the same. So perforating injury, also there can be a retained intraocular foreign body. So whenever you are suspecting a perforating injury, so remember, any injury to the eye with a metallic foreign body, MRI is an absolute contraindication. So you should not do an MRI. Second thing, the most common intraocular foreign body is usually iron. Okay, so metallic foreign body, among the metallic foreign body, the most common is iron, and the most dangerous among the metals is the copper. Again, the copper usually is available as alloys. Okay, so if the concentration of copper is more in the alloy, it indicates a very poor prognosis. Okay, so in the eye, the inflammation will be more severe. If the concentration of copper in the foreign body is more, the inflammation in the eye will be more severe. So these we have discussed in the class. Again, these you can get questions in the future. So remember, iron foreign body, copper is most dangerous. Okay, so this chart, so we have already discussed, this is a Hess chart. Okay, the Hess chart or the Lesch chart is used for in case patients with diplopia, in case of a paralytic squint. Diplopia, okay, in case of a patient with a paralytic squint. So in a patient with paralytic squint, what did we discuss? First, before we take up the patient for the diplopia charting, we can do a normal diplopia charting using the direct ophthalmoscope, the slit beam in the direct ophthalmoscope. We can put the Armstrong goggles in the patient's eye and do the diplopia charting. Okay, so we can, with the normal diplopia charting itself, we can come to know if it is a crossed or an uncrossed diplopia, if it's a crossed diplopia or a uncrossed diplopia. Next, in order to confirm the involvement of the muscle and the nerve, we can do the Hess charting. Okay, the Hess charting or the Lesch charting is done for confirming the involvement of the cranial nerve and the muscle. So this is your Hess charting. So next, you should know the difference between the Snellen's chart and the ETDRS chart. Okay, so remember, Snellen's chart is the ETDRS chart is a logarithmic chart. This is a logarithmic chart. This just measures the minimum acuity of resolution. This is a logMAR chart. Okay, this takes the logarithmic of the MAR. Okay, so this is the logMAR chart. So what is the important differences between the normal Snellen's chart and the logMAR chart or the ETDRS chart? So ETDRS, the Snellen's chart, there is an irregular progression of the letter size. So you can see the letter size irregularly progress from higher to lower. Whereas in case of the logMAR chart, there is a uniform progression of a letter size. So gradually it decreases. Next is there is a variable number of letters in Snellen's chart. So Snellen's chart, if you can see, the first line has only one letter, this second line 2 letters, third line 3 letters, fourth line 4, 5 and 6 accordingly. Whereas the logMAR chart or the ETDRS chart has equal number of letters in each line. There is an equal number of same number of letters in each line. There's a variable legibility or difficulty in testing these letters. All letters are of similar legibility in case of a ETDRS chart. The distance between each letter in case of a Snellen's chart is not uniform. So distance between this and this is not uniform, while the distance between the letters in each line is uniform in case of a logMAR chart or a ETDRS chart. So the font used, if they ask which is the font, in case of Snellen's chart is the serif's font. In case of a logMAR chart, it is a non-serif font. Okay. So another important, why do we use logarithmic? Why do you want to use logarithmic chart compared to the Snellen's chart? See, in amblyopia, what happens? One important feature of amblyopia is the crowding phenomena. Okay. So when you check a patient with amblyopia, a logMAR or an ETDRS chart is more valuable in checking for the crowding phenomena which occurs in amblyopia. Second thing is logarithmic chart. Also, the readings come in decibels. So what happens when you want, if you want to do a research, okay, when you're into research, you want to do paper publication, the logMAR chart or the ETDRS chart is used. because of standardization. It is standard. Okay, so hence it is preferred over the normal Snellen's visual acuity. Okay, so these are the important differences between the logMAR chart and the normal Snellen's vision chart. Next, we should know about the Peele-Robbins chart. Okay, so we discussed what is Peele-Robson chart. Peele-Robson chart is a contrast sensitivity scale. This is a contrast sensitivity scale. So what we can see? So we can see the letters are of same size, but the contrast between the two the lines will reduce. So the two charts, each chart has 6 letters in each row. So they are organized in 2 triplets of varying contrast. Okay, so the contrast gradually reduces. So they can ask you what is the illumination of this chart. So remember, the illumination of this chart is 85 candles per millimeter square, 85 candles per millimeter square, and the Peele-Robbins chart is done at a distance of 1 meter. So this also they can ask you. So this and this is very important. So 6 row of letters, each decreasing in contrast from the highest to the lowest. Okay. So next question, what would be the investigation of choice for a bilateral proptosis and chloroma in a child? Okay. So we discussed the one of the important causes for bilateral proptosis in children is a chloroma, is a type of a leukemia. So we have to, because it's a leukemia, we always have to do a peripheral blood smear. So this table shows the important causes of proptosis in children. So again, the first important is the thyroid eye disease. Always rule out a rhabdomyosarcoma. I told you rhabdomyosarcoma is the most common intraorbital tumor. The intraocular is the retinoblastoma. The intraorbital tumor, the most common intraorbital tumor is the rhabdomyosarcoma. Next, orbital cellulitis. You can also have an optic nerve glioma, orbital inflammatory disease, a retrobulbar hemorrhage, a chloroma, and a neuroblastoma and histiocytosis. So these are important causes for proptosis in children, right from thyroid eye disease to histiocytosis. So one of the important causes is chloroma. So chloroma is a type of leukemia. So we have to do a peripheral blood smear in these patients. So this question is a combination of both your pathology and ophthalmology. So we know chloroma can present as a bilateral proptosis, but they want to know if you know that it is a tumor. Okay, so that is what they are testing in this question. So there will be a lot of integrated questions going forward. Okay, we'll have a lot of integrated from medicine, ophthalmology, medicine, neurology, ophthalmology, neurology, ophthalmology, pathology. Going forward, the trend is they want to check if you have understood the subjects or you have blindly memorized it. Okay, so try solving more of USMLE pattern questions. Try to understand the question before blindly attempting it. Okay, don't memorize things. Try to understand and then attempt the question. That is what is important. So next we should know the important causes for an axial proptosis versus a non-axial or eccentric proptosis. So the important causes for axial, what is axial proptosis? There is a uniform linear increase in the proptosis. Non-axial, either it increases downward or increases upward or it increases side or left. So that is an eccentric proptosis. So the important causes for a axial proptosis is thyroid ophthalmopathy, orbital cellulitis, cavernous hemangioma, a keratoconus fistula, an optic nerve glioma, and an ophthalmic artery aneurysm. So these are important causes of axial proptosis. The important causes for an eccentric proptosis is a lacrimal gland tumor, a frontal mucocele, an ethmoidal mucocele, a maxillary carcinoma, and a chloroma. So remember, a lacrimal gland tumor. Okay, lacrimal gland tumor will result in a proptosis directed inferior nasally. So both frontal mucocele and a lacrimal gland tumor result in an inferior nasal type of a proptosis. An ethmoidal mucocele and a maxillary sinus will result in a superior or a superior nasal or a superior temporal, depending on the involvement. Either a ethmoidal will be more of a superior temporal, maxillary will be a superior type of a eccentric proptosis. Chloroma, I told you, is the type of a AML which results in a non-axial type of proptosis. So you have to do a peripheral blood smear. So hand and eye movement coordination is mediated by. So this I told you when we discussed about the horizontal gaze which controls the vertical gaze, the optokinetic nystagmus, okay, the functions of the parietal lobe. So the most important function, one of the most important functions of the parietal lobe is the hand-eye coordination. So hand-eye coordination, eye movements, and output. At the output to the frontal lobe is mainly the hand-eye coordination, the eye movements, and the attention. Okay, so these three are transmitted from the parietal to the frontal lobe. Also, the frontal lobe processes messages such as touch, taste, and temperature. Touch, temperature, and taste are modulated by the parietal lobe. It also contains motor cortex which controls movement. It also controls the movement. Okay. Next, we have a 14-day-old neonate with a bilateral conjunctivitis. So the X-ray shows presence of infiltrate. So which is the most probable diagnosis? So again, I told you there is a table which I have clearly discussed in class. So see, this is a very important table I told you have to remember. So within the first 6 hours, always think of a chemical conjunctivitis. First 6 hours after birth, presence of injection, presence of watering, presence of discharge in the eye, always rule out a chemical conjunctivitis. Within the first 7 days of birth, okay, presence of injection with a purulent discharge and a edema, always think of a gonococcal conjunctivitis. Beyond 7 days, within 14 days, first think of chlamydia. So remember, chlamydia produces severe injection, watery purulent discharge, pseudomembrane can be there. There can be an associated pneumonia associated with chronicity. Herpes also can present any time between first to 14 days. Okay. Late onset, always think of chlamydial infection. So herpes, it presents with watery discharge, injection, there's presence of edema, lid edema, and associated keratitis. Okay. So this is very important. This we have discussed in the class. Always remember the first 6 hours is chemical, 14 hours is chlamydial infection. Okay. So with this, we will finish the class for today. So hopefully this is useful. Okay. So advise you to listen to the class carefully and attempt the question after having read it thoroughly. Okay. So going forward, prepare with the pattern similar to the USMLE. Okay. Your FMCG pattern. And also you're getting a lot of questions from the FRCS pattern. Okay, FRCS ophthalmology questions also I am seeing nowadays. Okay, so you have to prepare clinically. You'll have to understand the subject first and then prepare accordingly. Okay, so with this I'll end the class. Hopefully this is useful. Thank you.
Best training, peaceful environment, PG medical entrance exam preparation were my expectations. I got them at Speed Medical Village in Kanchipuram. Today I am a PG topper.
Speed Medical Village, a unique eco-friendly campus dedicated for PG preparation. Speed Medical Institute, a complete solution for medical education.